There is a particular kind of courage that comes not from playing heroes on a silver screen, but from standing in the middle of an industry built on illusion and saying out loud what everyone else has chosen to ignore. Paul Newman was that kind of man. Over the course of his remarkable life and career, Newman became known not only for his extraordinary performances in films like Cool Hand Luke, The Hustler, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but also for something far rarer in Hollywood: an uncompromising moral compass that refused to bend for fame, money, or the comfort of powerful friends. Newman entered Hollywood in the early 1950s, at a time when the studio system still ruled with an iron grip. He watched from up close as publicists manufactured personalities, as journalists were quietly paid off, and as the machinery of illusion turned monsters into icons. Unlike many of his contemporaries who preferred to look the other way, Newman spoke openly. In interviews, in private conversations, and at industry panels, about what he had witnessed behind the Golden Curtain. He was, by most accounts, a man who believed the truth mattered more than popularity. What makes Newman's observations particularly powerful is that he was not an outsider looking in. He was one of Hollywood's most celebrated figures, which means he had access to the conversations, the rooms, and the moments that ordinary journalists never could. The names he mentioned over the years were not tabloid gossip. They were personal observations from a man who had watched Hollywood's darkest tendencies operate in plain sight for decades. Tonight, we walk through the names Paul Newman mentioned, reflected on, or spoke about in documented interviews and conversations. Men and women of Hollywood's golden age whose public images were constructed to hide private realities that were, in many cases, deeply troubling. These are not mere rumors. These are stories supported by memoirs, court records, journalistic accounts, and the testimonies of those who lived through them. Let us begin. To understand the gap between Hollywood's mythology and its reality, there may be no clearer starting point than Joan Crawford. In the 1930s and 1940s, Crawford was one of the most bankable and admired actresses in the world. Her comeback in the 1945 film Mildred Pierce earned her an Academy Award and cemented her status as a survivor. A woman who clawed her way back to the top through sheer force of will. Fan magazines adored her. Studios presented her as the embodiment of motherly devotion, particularly after she adopted several children and spoke publicly about the joys of raising a family. The reality, according to her eldest daughter Christina Crawford, was something entirely different. Christina's 1978 memoir, Mommy Dearest, shook the entertainment world. It described a childhood defined not by warmth and stability, but by unpredictable rage, humiliation, and physical punishment. Christina wrote of being dragged from her bed in the middle of the night, of being punished for minor infractions with methods that would today be recognized as abuse, and of living in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing which version of her mother would appear. She described a household governed by fear, where servants and children alike learned to anticipate Joan's moods the way sailors watch the weather before a storm. What made Crawford's case particularly disturbing to those who knew her, including Paul Newman, who once referenced her as evidence that Hollywood rewarded performance over character, was the seamless way she maintained two entirely separate identities. On the red carpet, she was grace and glamour personified. In the pages of fan magazines, she was a devoted mother who had opened her heart and her home. And behind closed doors, according to her daughter and several former household staff members, she was something that no amount of screen credits could justify. Newman, reflecting on Crawford in a late 1970s interview with the New York Times, reportedly described her as the clearest example he had ever seen of Hollywood's fundamental flaw, its willingness to preserve an image at any cost, even when those closest to that image were being quietly destroyed by it. He said, with characteristic bluntness, that an Oscar has never told us anything about the person who holds it, only about the performance they gave on a particular afternoon. Joan Crawford died in 1977. When her will was read aloud, it specifically excluded both Christina and her brother Christopher, citing reasons they already knew. It was a final act of control that struck many observers as deeply revealing. Even after death, the performance continued. If Joan Crawford's darkness hid behind glamour and sequins, Bing Crosby's hid behind something far more calculated, the image of wholesome all-American fatherhood. Crosby was, for many decades, the most commercially successful entertainer in the world. His voice sold records by the tens of millions. His holiday performances became cultural traditions. Television and radio networks presented him as a model of decency, a family man whose warmth radiated from every performance. His son Gary Crosby dismantled that image in his 1983 autobiography, Going My Own Way. The book described a father who ruled his household through intimidation and physical punishment, a man whose public gentleness was a performance as carefully constructed as any of his recordings. Gary wrote with painful honesty about the fear that defined his childhood, about learning to read his father's moods and brace for consequences, about the emotional distance that never closed no matter how many years passed. The tragedy extended across the family. Multiple members of the Crosby family struggled with addiction, depression, and psychological damage that biographers and family members have consistently traced back to the household environment being created. 2 of his sons from his first marriage died by suicide, leaving behind accounts that pointed, in part, to the unprocessed trauma of their upbringing. Paul Newman was reportedly deeply disturbed by Crosby's case, not because it was unique, but because it was so perfectly representative of a broader pattern. Hollywood had invested enormous resources in protecting Crosby's image because his image sold products, filled theaters, and kept networks in business. The industry had a financial stake in making sure the public never looked too closely at the man behind the microphone. And so, for decades, it didn't. Newman made the observation, during a 1985 industry panel discussion, that the entertainment business had a remarkable ability to confuse popularity with virtue. Crosby was beloved by millions who had never met him, and that love was built entirely on a carefully managed fiction. The people who actually knew him, his children, his household employees, carried a very different story, one that the industry had no interest in hearing. Bing Crosby died in 1977, just months after playing golf in Spain. He was eulogized as a national treasure. The complexity of the man behind the legend took years to reach public conversation, and even today, his holiday recordings fill shopping malls every December, the mythology still intact, still glowing, still carefully detached from the human being it represents. Few Golden Age stars embodied the concept of dangerous charm more completely than Errol Flynn. He was physically extraordinary, tall, magnetic, and possessed of an effortless screen presence that made audiences forget they were watching a performance. His swashbuckling roles made him an international star, and his personal reputation as a roguish adventurer only seemed to enhance his appeal. Hollywood loved the idea of him. The reality was considerably more troubling. In 1942, Flynn stood trial on charges of statutory rape involving 2 underage girls. The case became one of the most sensational trials in Hollywood history, drawing enormous press coverage and splitting public opinion between those who believed the charges and those who refused to accept that their hero could be capable of such behavior. Flynn was ultimately acquitted, a result that many legal observers at the time attributed as much to the power of his studio connections and the sympathy of a carefully selected jury as to the strength of the evidence. Flynn walked out of the courthouse with a smirk and a lit cigarette, making a quip to reporters that became infamous in Hollywood circles. He showed no apparent remorse, no apparent discomfort, no apparent recognition that 2 young girls had told a court about their experiences with him. Paul Newman, who referenced Flynn in several later interviews, described the acquittal and its aftermath as one of the clearest demonstrations he had ever witnessed of how Hollywood's protective machinery operated. Studios had financial interests in Flynn's continued marketability. Those interests shaped what evidence surfaced, which journalists published what, and how the narrative was ultimately framed for public consumption. The rumors around Flynn never fully subsided after the trial. Journalists, biographers, and former associates continued to document a pattern of behavior that suggested the 1942 case had not been an isolated incident but rather a moment when Hollywood's usual protections had briefly and publicly failed. Flynn himself seemed unbothered. He continued making films, continued accumulating stories that circulated through industry circles, and died in 1959 at the age of 50, his body, according to the attending physician, significantly more deteriorated than his age would suggest. Hollywood chose to remember Flynn through his films, the dashing hero of The Adventures of Robin Hood, the gallant lead of Captain Blood. Newman's perspective, expressed in various conversations over the years, was that this choice revealed something important about the industry's moral priorities. A man's ability to entertain was weighed against the credibility of those he had harmed, and entertainment had won. Mickey Rooney's career is one of the most extraordinary in Hollywood history. As a child star and then a young leading man, he was MGM's most profitable asset for years, a force of energy and charisma who seemed to embody everything optimistic about American popular culture. His Andy Hardy series made him a symbol of small-town wholesome values. His musicals with Judy Garland were celebrations of youth and possibility. Life magazine put him on its cover. The public adored him. Elizabeth Taylor, who came up through MGM in the early 1940s, reportedly told Paul Newman during a private conversation in 1974 that Mickey Rooney had frightened her more than almost anyone else she encountered during her years as a young actress at the studio. She described feeling watched and pursued at an age when she had neither the experience nor the power to effectively push back. Newman, reflecting on this conversation years later with Vanity Fair, said that Taylor's words had stayed with him because of how matter-of-factly she delivered them, as though she had simply accepted that this was how things had been and that nothing could have been done. The imbalance of power that Taylor described was fundamental to understanding the era. Rooney was one of MGM's biggest stars. Taylor was a teenage newcomer whose entire career existed at the pleasure of the studio. The people who might have protected her had financial incentives not to create conflict with someone as valuable as Rooney. The system that should have provided accountability instead provided cover, and the young actress learned early what many of her peers also learned, that silence was the price of continued employment. Newman's observation about Rooney, made at a press conference in 1982, was that the entertainment industry had a particular fondness for hiding its most troubling behavior behind its most beloved faces. A villain no one likes is easy to condemn. A beloved entertainer who has caused genuine harm is a problem the industry would rather not solve, because solving it requires acknowledging that the adoration was misplaced, and that is a far more uncomfortable reckoning. Bette Davis was, by almost any measure, one of the greatest actresses who ever worked in Hollywood. Her range was extraordinary, her commitment to her craft was absolute, and her willingness to take on complex, difficult roles at a time when female stars were expected to play decorative and sympathetic characters made her genuinely revolutionary. She fought her studio for better scripts, better roles, and better pay at a time when almost no one was fighting at all. But greatness on screen did not translate into decency off it, and the accounts left behind by those who worked alongside Davis paint a picture of someone who deployed her considerable force of personality in ways that caused real harm to real people. The most documented example involves her professional relationship with Joan Crawford during the production of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? In 1962. The two women shared a mutual animosity that had been building for decades, and their pairing on that film produced a set environment that crew members would describe for years afterward as genuinely frightening. The physical confrontations were serious enough to result in injury. The psychological warfare was relentless. What might have been a creative collaboration between two remarkable talents became, by multiple accounts, a sustained exercise in mutual destruction that everyone else on set was simply required to survive. Away from her feud with Crawford, Davis carried a reputation for behavior that went considerably beyond artistic temperament. Younger actresses described being publicly humiliated in front of cast and crew. Supporting actors spoke of an environment where the threat of her displeasure was a constant background tension. Crew members developed systems for warning each other when her mood was deteriorating, treating the information like a weather alert. Paul Newman, who witnessed Davis publicly humiliate a young actress early in his career, said that he had never questioned her talent for a moment, but that talent had never struck him as a sufficient justification for the fear she spread around her. Hollywood has always made allowances for difficult behavior from its most gifted performers, Newman observed, and Davis was perhaps the clearest illustration of where that allowance could lead. Kirk Douglas built a career on portrayals of strength, courage, and rugged individualism. His performance as the slave leader in Spartacus became one of cinema's enduring images of the fight for human dignity. Off-screen, he cultivated a reputation as a serious artist and a man of principle, someone who had broken the Hollywood blacklist by publicly crediting the blacklisted writer Dalton Trumbo on Spartacus, an act of genuine courage during a period of considerable political cowardice in the industry. And yet, alongside that public legacy, a different set of stories circulated through Hollywood for decades. Accounts that studios consistently chose not to investigate and that the industry's press infrastructure consistently chose not to publish. The most serious allegation involves Natalie Wood. In 1954, Wood was 15 years old and a working actress whose career MGM was actively managing. According to accounts that emerged years later, including through her sister Lana Wood's memoir and subsequent public statements, Wood attended what was described as a professional meeting and returned from it shaken and distressed in ways that her family found alarming. Wood herself reportedly made private statements about the encounter that were deeply troubling, though the full details were suppressed for many years by the same studio machinery that had arranged the meeting in the first place. Wood did not speak publicly about what had happened. The economics of the situation made silence essentially mandatory. She was a young actress whose career depended entirely on the goodwill of the same industry that employed Douglas. Speaking out would have ended her career without producing any consequences for him. It was the same calculus that kept dozens of similar accounts quiet throughout Hollywood's golden age and well into subsequent decades. Paul Newman addressed Douglas directly in a 60 Minutes interview, suggesting that the honorary recognition Douglas received later in his career, the Lifetime Achievement Tributes, the humanitarian celebrations, existed in deliberate ignorance of accounts that Hollywood had chosen to bury because Douglas was too valuable and too connected to expose. Newman's position was that genuine accountability requires engaging with the uncomfortable stories, not simply celebrating the comfortable ones. Gloria Swanson's career peaked in the silent film era, when she was arguably the most famous woman in the world. Her films were events. Her wardrobe made international news. Her lifestyle, extravagant, theatrical, and utterly unconcerned with the financial limitations that governed ordinary life, became the template for what the public imagined when it imagined Hollywood royalty. The production of Queen Kelly in 1928 provides perhaps the clearest window into what Swanson's unchecked ego actually cost. The project began as an ambitious collaboration with the visionary director Erich von Stroheim and quickly collapsed under the weight of Swanson's demands. Sets were rebuilt to her specifications. Costumes were replaced repeatedly. Shooting schedules collapsed as she required particular conditions that consistently failed to materialize. The film was never completed. The money spent on it represented a significant portion of the producing budget, and the hundreds of crew members who had worked on it found themselves without either completed work to show or adequate compensation for their time. Swanson apparently viewed this outcome as primarily a creative tragedy. Her vision, she felt, had been imperfectly realized. The perspectives of the craftspeople who had given months of their lives to the project received considerably less attention in her accounting of events. Her personal extravagance during the Depression years became a source of genuine public bitterness. While the economic crisis destroyed millions of American families, Swanson continued to live as she always had, at a scale that seemed almost deliberately disconnected from the suffering around her. Her eventual comeback in Sunset Boulevard in 1950, in which she played a delusional silent film actress unable to accept that her era had ended, struck many observers as being remarkably close to documentary. Newman's assessment of Swanson was characteristically direct. He observed that Hollywood had never fully held to account those whose ego caused large-scale suffering to ordinary working people. The carpenters, the costume assistants, the lighting crews who paid the real price for a star's unchecked demands. Swanson, he suggested, was the industry's most extreme example of what happened when no one in the system was willing to say no. Wallace Beery was one of MGM's great character stars, rough-edged, physically imposing, and possessed of an unlikely warmth on screen that made him one of the most popular actors of the 1930s. His Oscar-winning performance in The Champ in 1931 demonstrated real dramatic depth, and audiences connected with him in a way that made him a reliable commercial draw for years. The private accounts were substantially darker. Beery's first marriage to Gloria Swanson ended in circumstances that Swanson described, in her own memoir, as including physical violence. She did not elaborate extensively, but the description she provided was unambiguous. Former colleagues and crew members described a pattern of aggressive physical behavior on set, with young and relatively powerless actors and extras bearing the brunt of what witnesses characterized as genuine cruelty rather than mere roughness of manner. The most serious cloud over Beery's name involves the 1937 death of Ted Healy, the comedian and founding member of the Three Stooges. Healy died following injuries sustained in a confrontation at a Los Angeles nightclub. Contemporary press accounts noted the presence of a large man whose description matched Beery's at the scene, and several journalists at the time raised questions about the circumstances of the death that were never formally investigated. MGM moved Beery out of the country in the days following the incident, a decision that, in retrospect, raises questions about what the studio knew and what it was working to protect.